The first sign that something was wrong came with the sound of breaking wood. Thomas Henriksen had only meant to replace one rotten floorboard in the northwest corner of his barn. That cold March morning in 1883, but when he pressed his boot down, the entire board gave way. His leg plunged through the floor up to the knee before he caught himself on the surrounding planks. His heart jumped. This was no simple soft spot. It felt like open space below him. He pulled his leg free and knelt down, brushing away dirt and loose splinters. Thomas expected to see a shallow pit or maybe a collapsed root cellar. What he saw instead made him freeze in place. Beneath the broken floor was darkness, deep enough that he could not see the bottom. It was too deep, too wide, too clean-cut to be anything natural. He hurried to fetch a lantern. When he held the light over the hole and lowered it through the opening, his breath caught in his throat. This was no hollow, it was a room, and the lantern revealed a chamber carved straight into the earth. The space looked to be 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. The walls were lined with tight stacks of sawed bricks sent with the same care used to build a fine sod house. For cottonwood beams crossed the ceiling with clean notches built to hold weight for decades, and in the far corner, half hidden in shadow, sat a small sheet iron stove, a stove beneath a barn. Thomas widened the opening slowly, pulling up boards until he could lower himself safely. He dropped into the chamber and landed on hard-packed dirt. The air smelled of old smoke and dry earth. No mold, no dampness. Whoever built this built it well. The sod walls were tight, every seam packed with clay. There was no sign of rodents or water damage. The stove, though small, was real iron, not homemade. It sat on a bed of flat stones. And when he looked up, he saw the thin pipe running up through the barn floor, ending in what he had always assumed was a normal barn vent. Someone had hidden a working stove down here. Thomas stood in the center of that secret room and tried to understand why a man would carve a warm shelter beneath his barn and tell nobody about it. He was only 29, a Norwegian immigrant who had worked 5 years just to save enough money for this homestead. His wife Ingrid and their young son Niels depended on every good decision he made. Fuel was expensive, winters were deadly, the house he had bought was small and drafty. Heating it would take what he did not have time or money to gather. But this room, this hidden earth-sheltered space warmed by a tiny stove insulated on every side by Mother Earth herself, this was something else entirely. The widow who sold the property, Mrs. Adelaide Cooper, never mentioned anything like it. She hated Kansas winters, hated the lonely farm, and wanted nothing more than to go live with her daughter in Ohio. But Thomas believed her. This secret room didn't feel like the work of a woman who hid things. It felt like the work of a man who trusted no one. He asked around town quietly. What he learned matched his suspicion. Albert Cooper, the widow's late husband, had been difficult, angry, and private. In the winter of 1873, while neighbors battled deadly cold, Cooper claimed his barn stayed warm enough to work in comfortably. Nobody believed him. But folks remembered seeing smoke from the barn's vent every day that winter, more smoke than any animal shelter should need. Cooper had built this place. Cooper had survived winter in warmth while neighbors froze. And Cooper had taken the secret to his grave. Now the secret belonged to Thomas. For 3 days he examined the chamber, checking beams, walls, airflow, and the hidden pipe. The space was solid, usable, safe, and in that quiet darkness, Thomas began to see the truth. This room could solve his biggest problem. The Henriksen family could not afford 6 cords of winter wood. But this tiny underground shelter might only need a fraction of that. Maybe 1/6, maybe less. When he told Ingrid, she raised an eyebrow. Why keep it secret? She asked. If it works, I'll share it. Thomas shook his head. Not yet. If we tell people now, they will laugh like they laughed at Cooper. Let us prove it first. If it fails, no one needs to know. So Thomas worked through April and May, crawling underground, reinforcing beams, adding a second layer of sawed bricks, digging a disguised vent, and creating a trap door that vanished under scattered hay. He carried dirt out by hand, bucket after bucket, until his back throbbed every night. But by early summer, the dugout was ready, hidden, warm, waiting. Neighbors noticed the small wood pile behind his house and shook their heads. "You planning to freeze in January?" one asked. Thomas only smiled. "I'll manage by November." When the first freeze crept across the windows of the house, Thomas walked quietly to the barn, brushed aside the hay, lifted the trap door, and climbed down into the underground room. He lit the stove. Within 20 minutes, the chill melted into gentle, steady warmth. The thermometer rose past 58, while outside, the wind cut like a knife. For the first time since buying the farm, Thomas felt hope. What he had found beneath that barn was more than a secret. It was a lifeline. Winter settled over Kansas like a heavy iron lid. By early December, most homesteaders fought the cold from dawn till night, burning wood faster than they could cut it. Families shivered inside thin-walled houses while frost crawled across windows like a living thing. But at the Henriksen farm, things were different. Quietly, secretly, almost strangely different. Thomas and Ingrid had built a routine that no neighbor would have understood. Each morning, Thomas lit a small fire in the house stove, just enough to keep pipes from freezing and to make the place look normal whenever anyone visited. But the real warmth waited beneath the barn. Once chores were done and no visitor was in sight, the family slipped across the yard and climbed down into the hidden dugout. Down there, the air felt soft and steady. The walls held the heat like a sponge. The little stove worked magic, turning small handfuls of wood and dried grass into hours of comfort. Ingrid mended clothes. Thomas repaired tools. Their 5-year-old boy, Neil, played on the dirt floor with carved wooden animals. Above them, the wind howled across the prairie. Below, the family lived in calm warmth. By mid-December, Thomas had used barely a fraction of his fuel, while neighbors' wood piles shrank by the week. His secret supply in the barn loft was nearly untouched. Still, he stayed careful when a knock came at the door. He rushed back to the house before anyone suspected a thing. One afternoon, Erik Thorson came by, stamping snow from his boots. His face looked worn and tired. His wood pile was half gone, and it was only December. He eyed Thomas closely while warming his hands near the weak house stove. "You're looking better than I expected," Erik said. "Your family don't look frozen. Your boy's cheeks aren't even red. What's your secret?" Thomas felt his pulse jump, but he kept his face calm. "No secret," he said. "We're Norwegian. We know how to layer clothes." Erik frowned. "Nobody layers enough to beat this cold. You've got half the firewood I do. Yet you look warmer." Thomas forced a smile. "We manage." Erik left unconvinced. When the door shut, Ingrid turned to her husband. "He knows something," she whispered. "I know." Thomas said, "But we hold on a little longer. We show people only when we're certain." The real test came during Christmas week of 1883. Temperatures dropped faster than anyone believed possible. 20 below zero the first night, 23 below the second. And families across the valley fought for survival. Wood piles vanished, people burned furniture, some burned fence rails. The cold killed livestock inside barns. It froze water within minutes. It bit skin like a knife. But beneath the Henriksen barn, the warmth held. On Christmas morning, while the general store thermometer read 28 below zero, Thomas lit the dugout stove and watched the temperature rise to 50. It was not luxury, but it was life, real safe, steady life. But that day, the family did not leave the underground room. They brought blankets, food, water, and spent the hours reading, sewing, and talking. Niels treated it like a grand adventure. Ingrid managed the tiny space with calm steadiness. Thomas tended the fire with quiet gratitude. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he thanked the bitter, suspicious man who had built this. Late that evening, as the storm screamed across the prairie above them, Thomas sat beside the stove and made a promise. When winter ended, he would share the knowledge with everyone. He would not keep it like Cooper had. Survival belonged to the community. When the cold finally eased on December 27th, Thomas climbed up to check the house. He built a fire, warmed the rooms, and stepped outside just in time to see Erik Thorson trudging across the yard. The man looked terrible. His hands were wrapped in cloth. His face was wind-burned raw. His eyes burned with frustration and fear. Yet, he did not waste time on greetings. "Alright," Eric said. "I want the truth. Your family looks fine. Your woodpile hasn't moved. We burned everything we had and still nearly froze. What are you doing that we're not?" Thomas looked at his neighbor for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Come with me." He led Eric to the barn, kicked aside the hay, lifted the trap door, and revealed the warm glow rising from below. Eric stared speechless. "It's an underground room," Thomas said quietly. "When I found it by accident last spring. The previous owner built it and never told anyone. We've been using it all winter. You've been living underground," Eric whispered, stunned. "Not living," Thomas said, "surviving safely, warmly, using a fraction of the wood." Eric climbed down. The heat stunned him. He touched the sod walls. He stared at the small stove. He shook his head. Slowly. "This could have saved us," he whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I had to be sure it worked," Thomas said. "But I'm telling you now." Eric swallowed hard. "Can I bring my family here for a few days? We have nothing left to burn." Thomas nodded. "Bring them tonight." The secret was over and everything was about to change. Eric returned that evening with his wife, Karen, and their 3 children. They looked worn down by the cold, pale, and exhausted, wrapped in every blanket they owned. But when they climbed down into the dugout, the warmth washed over them like a miracle. Karen's eyes filled with tears. The children sat close to the stove, rubbing their hands, whispering with relief. For 2 days, the Thorson family stayed underground with the Henriksons, warm and safe, while Eric worked to secure emergency firewood from town. During that time, Eric asked question after question. How was the dugout built? How deep should it be? How thick were the sod walls? How did the ventilation work? What would burn best? Thomas answered every question without holding anything back. The knowledge no longer belonged to one man. It belonged to all of them. By early January, word had spread through the community. Some neighbors came curious, some doubtful, some embarrassed that they had mocked Cooper years ago for claiming his barn stayed warm. But when they stepped into the hidden dugout and felt its steady heat, their doubt melted like ice in spring. Families began asking for help. They wanted to build their own underground shelters before the next winter came. Thomas agreed gladly. The memory of the cold snap was still raw, and he did not want to hear of any family suffering what the Thorsons had faced. When the ground thawed in April, the digging began. Thomas helped 5 homesteaders build their own versions of the winter dugout. Some chose to place them under barns, copying Cooper's hidden design. Others built small separate structures near their homes. Every dugout had thick sod walls, strong beams, a compact iron stove, and a safe ventilation pipe hidden in plain sight. The work was heavy, but the hope it carried made it easier. Not every attempt went perfectly. One man dug too deep and hit groundwater, forcing him to abandon the project. Another family nearly poisoned themselves when they built the vent wrong. But Thomas fixed it before tragedy struck. Each mistake became part of the learning, something new to pass along to the next family. By the winter of 1884, the valley looked different. Smoke rose from barn vents that hid small stovepipes. Families used far less wood. Many, for the first time in years, had enough money left after winter to buy seed, tools, and livestock. But the underground shelters changed the community in ways nobody expected. What had once been a desperate fight for survival became a season people could face with confidence, even strength. Neighbors began calling Thomas the man who shared the secret. He always corrected them. "I didn't create it," he said. "I only found it. Cooper built it. I just made sure nobody else froze." But deep down, he knew the truth. Cooper had built the shelter from fear. He trusted no one. But he survived a brutal winter alone and told not a single soul. His brilliance began and ended with himself. Thomas used the same idea, but with a different heart. He shared, and sharing changed everything. The years passed. Thomas and Ingrid raised 4 children on that homestead. The small 3-room house was eventually replaced in 1895 with a sturdier home. But Thomas continued using the dugout every winter for his workshop, until he built a warmer space above ground. Even then, he kept the old room intact. Visitors often came to see the famous hidden shelter that had saved so many lives. When Thomas finally sold the property in 1926, the new owners continued using the dugout. It survived through more winters, more families, more storms. The barn above it aged and leaned but refused to fall. It lasted until 1968, almost a century after Albert Cooper first carved that space into the earth. Yet, when a construction crew arrived to tear down the barn to make room for modern equipment, they uncovered the dugout. They stared at it, confused. It made no sense to them why someone would build a room under a barn. But the old foreman, whose grandfather had homesteaded in the 1880s, knew exactly what it was. It's a winter dugout, he said. These things saved families back then. They filled it in with rubble that same week, and the space that had protected. So many finally returned to the earth, but photographs survived. Pictures of the barn standing plain and ordinary, hiding the secret beneath its floor. Pictures of Thomas gray-haired but strong, showing the dugout to curious neighbors. Pictures of a room that turned winter from an enemy into something families could face without fear. What lasted even longer than the structure was the lesson. Two men discovered the same idea. One hid it, one shared it. Albert Cooper survived winter but died bitter and alone. But Thomas Henriksen survived winter and helped a community survive with him. In the end, the difference wasn't the dugout, it was the heart behind it.